Today, we're looking at the trade friction heating up again between the U.S. and China.
Right.
And specifically, we're zeroing in on China's recent decision to halt exports of certain rare earth elements to the U.S.
A big move.
Yeah, really big move. What does it signal about, their readiness for maybe a more escalated trade war? We've waded through a stack of reports and data to pull out the key insights for you, nice and quick.
Okay, so setting the scene. China's economy, well, it's still growing. We saw, 4.9% in 2024?
Mm-hmm.
And projected maybe 4.5% in 2025. So decent, but definitely a slower pace than before.
Right, moderated.
Moderated, exactly. But at the same time, that U.S. trade deficit with China, still huge. Nearly $300 billion in 2024.
Wow.
Yeah, U.S. imports around $439 billion, exports back only $143 billion or so. Though, interestingly, Mexico has actually overtaken China as the top U.S. export partner.
Oh, that's a shift.
It is. And counterintuitively, maybe. Overall, U.S.-China trade actually ticked up slightly in early 2025,
right.
about 2.9%. Chinese exports to the U.S. were up 4.5%.
Huh. So it's complicated. It's not just a straight decline.
Not at all. And you look inside China's economy, sure, copper ore mining, building construction, they're big revenue drivers now. But the real push, the future focus, it's tech, EVs, e-commerce, healthcare, logistics.
Yeah, you see that in their industrial output figures too, right? Like up nearly 6% earlier this year.
Exactly. And specifically, strong growth in high-tech manufacturing. It shows a clear strategic pivot.
Okay, so the takeaway is moderate growth overall. But they're making a strategic bet on future tech dominance. And that persistent trade imbalance, that still gives them leverage, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And that leverage connects directly to these rare earth elements. They're just indispensable.
Right. For what exactly?
Oh, everything high-tech. Your smartphone, computers, LEDs, crucial for clean energy. Think EV motors, wind turbines, aerospace, defense systems, missiles, drones, you name it.
And magnets are a big part of that.
A huge part. Permanent magnets were like 44% of the end use back in 2022. And this is where China's dominance is just overwhelming.
How dominant are we talking?
Well, think about this. Around 70% of the global mine production in 2022. But the really critical number, about 87% of the refined production.
87%.
Yeah. And it gets even starker. They control roughly 90% of the refining capacity. Until 2023, they supplied virtually all 99% of the world's heavy rare earths.
So it's not just digging them up, it's the processing. That's the choke point.
That's the absolute key leverage point. Owning the refining is like owning almost all the kitchens, not just having the raw ingredients. It impacts so many critical sectors.
Which brings us to their latest move, halting exports.
Right. Of 7 specific rare earths, samarium, gadolinium, terbium, dysprosium, crucial ones, and importantly, related magnets too, specifically targeting the U.S. as retaliation for increased tariffs.
So a calculated shot across the bow.
Definitely. And they've added this licensing requirement through their Ministry of Commerce. It's opaque, potentially slow. Basically a control valve.
Aimed squarely at U.S. tech, automotive, aerospace, defense sectors, EVs, smartphones, renewables, robotics, even missile systems. And finding these elements refined elsewhere. That's the challenge.
It's incredibly difficult, especially quickly. The refining infrastructure just doesn't exist at scale outside China right now.
Okay, so what are the immediate impacts? The second-order effects, you could say, in the U.S.?
Well, you're seeing immediate concern. Tech companies scrambling for alternatives for EVs, smartphones, renewables. We're hearing worries from allies, too, like South Korean chip makers.
And defense. You mentioned missiles, drones.
Yeah, the potential for critical U.S. military hardware to become inoperable or at least face major supply chain issues, being components in things like the F-A-18 Hornet, Boeing systems. It's a direct national security risk.
And this ripples through all manufacturing, really. Tesla, Boeing, semiconductors.
Broad impact. And the U.S. just doesn't have much domestic capacity. We have, one active rare earth mine, Mountain Pass. And our stockpiles aren't nearly as robust as, say, Japan's.
Plus, could China use that licensing process to gather intel, figure out exactly who needs what, and hit them later?
That's certainly a risk some analysts are pointing out. It gives them market visibility. So the immediate takeaway is disruption, cost hikes across vital sectors. Very few easy alternatives right now.
And the longer-term effects, the third-order stuff.
We could be looking at permanent shifts in supply chains, higher costs becoming embedded, Companies seriously considering moving production, maybe Vietnam, Thailand, India, but that's a huge, complex process.
Which likely means more inflationary pressure here in the U.S., right, as those costs get passed on.
Higher intermediate goods costs, yeah, that tends to feed into inflation. And it pours fuel on the fire of technological decoupling.
And we already see U.S. restrictions on companies like Huawei and ZTE.
And China pushing hard for self-sufficiency in areas like semiconductors. It risks making things less efficient, potentially slowing innovation, especially in critical areas like AI.
So, bigger picture, this adds to worries about a global economic slowdown, a fractured world economy.
Absolutely. Risk of significant economic decoupling, a more fragmented global economy, maybe even undermining institutions like the WTO. It's a fundamental restructuring.
Okay, but how strong is China's own position? They have strengths, but also vulnerabilities, surely.
They do. Strengths are obvious.
Yeah.
Massive domestic market, incredibly strong manufacturing base. They're the only country covering all UN industrial categories. Largest manufacturer for 15 years now. Great infrastructure, strong supply chains, and that centralized government can plan strategically. Think 5-year plans.
But the weaknesses.
Well, reliance on the U.S. and the West for the most advanced semiconductors. That's
Yeah.
a big one. Impacts their R&D. Consumer confidence inside China has been a bit weak. Domestic consumption isn't firing on all cylinders. Then there are the well-known issues in the real estate market, local government debt.
And pressure from slowing global demand affecting their exports.
Exactly. So that push for tech self-sufficiency, while real, is definitely a long-term play. It's a mixed sales, and state control provide resilience, but there are pressure points the U.S. could potentially leverage.
So naturally, everyone's looking for alternatives now. What's out there?
Well, there are other potential sources. Canada has large reserves. The U.S. itself, Australia, Burma, Thailand, they have existing or potential production. There's even growing interest in deep-sea mining, though that's complex.
And substitutes, replacing these elements altogether.
Research is happening. Things like tetranite, they call it a cosmic magnet found in meteorites, or iron nitride, which might allow for supermagnets without rare earths. They've even made synthetic tetranite. But again, these are mostly longer-term prospects.
And the U.S. government is trying to push things along.
Yeah, the Department of Energy has programs like RPE, REACT. There are broader efforts to boost domestic mining and processing, which is key. The USGS is mapping out domestic resources. So efforts are underway, but building new mines and refineries takes years.
Which brings us back to the central question. How prepared is China for a prolonged trade fight right now? What's the consensus?
I'd say the prevailing view among experts is that China is strategically quite prepared and psychologically resilient. You hear phrases like eating bitterness, officials saying they'll fight to the end.
They see it as an existential struggle.
Seems that way, fundamental to their global standing. And they've learned from past disputes. The argument is they might feel they have a stronger hand now, less dependent on the U.S. market than before, plus this rare earth dominance.
But not without risks for them, too.
Oh, definitely. Forecasts like the Merrick's China forecast anticipate economic stress, maybe rising unemployment, forcing Beijing to prioritize public order. Reports highlight the real possibility of long-term decoupling. So strong consensus, they're ready to dig in, but underlying vulnerabilities are noted. A strategic shift towards boosting domestic consumption is also part of their response.
Okay, so boiling it down, China's rare earth restriction feels like a significant, calculated escalation. It signals they're ready, or believe they are ready, for a longer, tougher trade conflict. But the final chapter, still being written.
Right. Which leaves us with a thought for you, the listener. Considering how interconnected everything is, how reliant we all are on these critical materials, could this whole situation actually accelerate breakthroughs? Not just finding substitutes, but maybe sparking entirely new material sciences, new kinds of international partnerships outside the current big players.
Interesting thought. Something to definitely chew on. We hope this deep dive has helped cut through some of the noise and given you a clearer picture. Thanks for tuning in.